Okay, it looks like just about everybody has found their way in, and so I will say hello and welcome to the Warburg Institute's virtual lecture room for another director's seminar. And I am the director, so today's event is mine by name, but in every other respect, I think it belongs to my wonderful colleague, John Tresch, our Mellon Professor in the History of Art, Science, and Folk Practice. John was in fact a participant in the project and the publication that is the focus of today's seminar. So I'm quickly going to be handing over to John to introduce the event and its speakers. But before I do so, I quickly want to thank Joseph, Frédérique, Bruno, and John himself for allowing us here at the Warburg to engage with a project that is, to borrow one of its own key words, critical. I like the way it's almost always in all caps. It's a critical in all caps. It's critical in several senses. It not only grapples with the crisis in our relationship to the earth, but it attempts to reorient our thinking and our working by radically terrestrializing our methods and our perspectives. Now, it seems appropriate, I think, to air these issues, or maybe I should say to earth these issues, at the Institute founded by A.B. Warburg, whose own combination of thought experiment, exhibition, and book was named an atlas, and whose own maps, like those we'll hear about from our speakers, cross the boundaries between the arts and the sciences, between the theoretical and the political, and between the past and the future. So finally, and on a much more personal note, I just want to say it's a great privilege and even a thrill to be able to host several scholars who have been shaping my own thinking since I was a student. And of course, I'm still a student, so I'm very happy to have the opportunity again to learn with these great scholars and thinkers. So thanks very much for coming from me. And without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague, John Tresch.
Thanks, Bill. And thanks for that intro and for allowing this to happen. I'm thrilled to be here virtually and really delighted that all of you could make it. And very happy to have Bruno Latour, Joseph Leo Kerner, and Frédérique Aït-Touati here to talk about Arts of the Critical Zone. You've undoubtedly read the blurb that was in the summary of today's talk. Just to give a bit of background, the term critical zone is a way of approaching earth science and ecological science in a new integrative, interdisciplinary way. The critical zone is the space a few hundred meters above and below the Earth's surface. And in order to study it, scientists have been gathering together in new kinds of interdisciplinary spaces, critical zones observatories. And that means bringing geologists, hydrologists, soil scientists, meteorologists, botanists, biologists to work across the differences in their instruments, in their concepts, in their ways of working, in order to try to grasp this space where all of life on Earth happens, and to study its phenomena as they go across the globe, but also traverse many different scales, not just of space, but of time. The changing of the seasons week to week, as in weather and weather forecasts, but also years, centuries, epochs. That's what's going on in critical zones, bringing together in a radically interdisciplinary way many different branches of earth sciences to understand what's going on. The proposal that Bruno Latour, along with Peter Weibel, has put together in Critical Zones, the exhibit, which is still going on online, and it's there apparently under curtains in Karlsruhe at the ZKM. The proposal there was to expand the notion of critical zones and its interdisciplinarity to include the fact that humans are also part of that zone, not only because they're the ones who are making the knowledge, who are working across those divides to integrate their knowledge, but also because their activities as members of societies, as consumers and producers, are actually shaping what goes on in that critical zone. So adding the political reflection, the philosophical reflection, the artistic and anthropological reflection to all those other sciences is part of what Critical Zone as an exhibit and as this amazing collection is about. One of the results of bringing the human sciences into that space, this is one of the arguments across the book and the exhibits, is that the way we approach philosophy, the way we approach politics, the way we approach all of our disciplines has to change when we rethink each of them as being grounded in that space, in that fragile and interconnected space. What happens when all of those disciplines think of themselves terrestrially as made by and affecting that space of the earth? And that's a radical proposition. It's not just saying we need to have environmental humanities, we need to do environmental history. It's taking all of the disciplines and rethinking them as terrestrial disciplines. And given the Warburg's interest in history of art, its longstanding interest there, it seemed like a quite natural proposition to ask that question of art and of art history. What does art and art history look like from the critical zone? And there's no one better to answer that question than our speakers today, Bruno Latour, Joseph Leo Kerner, Frédérique Aït-Touati, each of whom has contributed to science studies, philosophy, art history, comparative literature, history of science in unique and important ways. What we're going to do today is have brief presentations from each of them in turn, 5 to 10 minutes at max, and then we'll have a conversation among them. And then in the final third of this hour and a half meeting, we'll open the ground up to conversation from you, questions from you, the audience. So again, thanks to speakers for being here and all of you for being here. And we'll begin with Bruno Latour. Bruno, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm glad to be with my colleagues who participated indeed, not only in the catalogue, but also in the show and in many other activities we did together. You have summarized very well what the critical zone is, and I just want to make a few points about the aesthetics of it, which is the title of a discussion. Aesthetic should be understood slightly differently, because it was first of all when I heard about critical zone from the critical zonist, I call them, the scientists from France, Germany, United States, England, etc., who work in the place that you very well defined, John. I was interested in a puzzle, a visual puzzle. So aesthetic for me was first of all the puzzle, which is that this little zone, which is a few kilometers thick, which has been made and maintained by living forms for the aeons, was unrepresentable, basically. When you look at the papers from the critical zonists, they didn't know how to represent it. I mean, literally, not only the general public is not clearly aware of where they are and what is the critical zone, but the scientists themselves were at odds to understand exactly why I am doing and what am I doing and how can all these disciplines collaborate with one another. And the reason, very clearly, is that the Earth is thought as a planet. The planet is viewed from the outside as the famous blue marble, we all know about it. But when you look at it, it's so thin, the little critical zone itself, that it loses its importance compared to the inside of the Earth, the whole geophysics, and of course, completely its importance compared in the infinite cosmos. So the first thing I did was to link people in the geoscience, especially geoscientist who was my mentor, with a very bright young architect and artist, Alexandra Arène, who then worked with Frédérique Aït-Touati, and we're still working with us in several projects, to invent a way to represent the critical zone. And aesthetics for me of critical zone was this first extremely interesting operation by which he took the earth and then made a sort of cut and then a reversion, just like you would do with a glove, and put inside the new model the atmosphere, and the earth in the critical zone sense, that is a small, what was a small surface, became as thick as you wanted it, and then the central of the earth was rejected to the border. So it was a very interesting experiment. It's not in any way an aesthetization of some scientific result, something which I've always, with Frédérique, we have always been fighting against this aesthetization of data. It was helping scientists represent in a credible way their own science, so to speak, their own object of science. And we published together a paper in a scientific journal, one geophysicist, one philosopher, and one architect and artist. And it was a very interesting experiment, the first one, which is at the origin of a critical zone catalogue and the critical zone exhibition. Again, this exhibition is under drape, as I say. So it's very important that aesthetics is here as a sort of help or a sort of push to force scientists into representing their own work differently. And it has some consequences, as John alluded to, which is, of course, that politically, it's slightly important to know where we are and can we represent the place where we are. And that's the second point I wanted to make of the aesthetics of a critical zone, which is the big work which is done in the catalogue as well as in the exhibition with this other unrepresentable character, which is Gaia. Gaia is exactly the same thing as critical zone, but taken in history, so to speak, taken as one history of a life with a capital L, from the first ancient bacteria or viruses all the way to the present situation. So Gaia is the critical zone in activity, so to speak. But it is very hard to represent. And this time it's another aesthetic problem, a huge one, which is that the imagination with which we talk about the whole, the big, is heavily influenced, or I would say contaminated, by sociological and political models, which make very difficult to understand Gaia. And here we have a very nice case with the COVID virus, because the COVID pandemic is actually a fairly good representation of a sort of being making Gaia. So here is an interesting puzzle. When people talk about Gaia, you have all sorts of metaphors coming from mothers, from all sorts of new age metaphors, which are immediately impinging on the definition of Gaia. When in fact, if you follow the study of the people who work on Gaia scientifically, it's still a puzzle to represent a big, which is the Earth, the living Earth, the one which is activated, which is limited to the critical zone, in a way that does not immediately shift to the notion of a superorganism. So is this an aesthetic question? Yes. Is it a technical question? Yes. Is it a sociological question? Yes. Is it a political question? Yes, indeed. They are all connected together because precisely we lack the imagination that allow to think the big, that is Gaia, as not being an organism which is sort of covering this whole Earth. And the very notion of the whole Earth is actually highly disputable. So this is what we are trying to do in the exhibition and with the catalogue, which is constantly pushing the limits of a mental model we have, which are always, as John knows very well, because that's what he works with, this very important notion of cosmogram that we have been using in not only in this exhibition, but in the other one in Taipei. The limits of a cosmogram make it very difficult for scientists as well as for citizens to represent where they are. And I'll finish, I was very interested reading recently, too late maybe, The Great Derangement by Avita Ghosh, because I found it a very interesting way to bring the aesthetics in it, which is the collective aspect of that question of ecology. Gaia and critical zone are just other words for the ecological mutation, right? And Ghosh made the point that we are overwhelmed by the ecological question. Every time we talk about it as individual, we are absolutely unable to cope with it and to make any sense of it affectively, cognitively, intellectually. Only some of the scientists are able to look at their data without just shooting their head. And the point he makes is that aesthetics, which is precisely what the novel, as you know in this argument, has missed, which is a very specific genre, as a way to individualize the aesthetics, which makes extremely difficult to represent in any sort of public sense the ecological mutation. And the whole book, as you know, is about that. Why is it impossible? Well, one of the reasons is that we are unable to produce the collective entity which has to be thought. And you see why it's in resonance and contradiction with the second point I made, which is precisely the aesthetics we have and the representation tool we have to represent the whole earth, the one we threaten and which threaten us, are extremely primitive. And they are not at the political and aesthetic and sociological level it should be. So there is a great importance here of the aesthetics as a way to produce collective entity, which are necessary to handle collectively and not just individually the question of ecological mutation. And this is why the catalogue is called the landing on Earth. I mean, the task of landing on Earth requires a science and politics of some sort. This is what I had to say. And the whole work we are doing now with Frédérique and other people is, I think, would be labeled geopathy. I'm interested in producing a textbook of geopathy, if you want. That is not geography, because geography is obsessed with space and has been lost in the notion of space, but geopathy as a way to feel the Earth and make it also, of course, the pathology of the Earth, pathology of a human on Earth. So this is what we have been trying to do. So it's, I think, from all this experience, which we are going to talk about, could be drawn maybe a reflexive idea of what aesthetic is about. But it's, of course, the thing we discussed many times with Joseph when we had the idea of bringing the sciences and what the painter were doing into the history of the 19th century. Because in fact, the argument of Joseph was, as you see in the catalogue, that they were also trying to instill a geopathic notion of what the Earth was about. And in the show, and I'll finish on that, one of the very beautiful moment is when you enter in Sarah Zay's amazing show, and then you go up the stairs and you find Joseph's beautiful assembly of painting from the 19th century. And that's exactly the sort of effect that we wanted to produce. Unfortunately, the virus, which is also a good model from Gaia and a very interesting way of contributing to a global through mouth-to-mouth contamination, interrupted our show, but not our conversation as we see here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bruno. And yes, thanks for keeping us aware of why we are here online and not in person. It's a wonderful metaphor. It's a wonderful illuminating fact, COVID, but it's also the thing that's stopping us from actually seeing that effect in 3 dimensions. Thanks very much for that wonderful overview. Now I'd like to move to Joseph Leo Kerner. And I know Bruno's mentioned some of the work you've already done in the catalog. And please, I know you have some images. Share your screen, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll just get over to the shared screen. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Bill, for organizing this event. And it's great to see Bruno again, and finally to meet you, Frédérique. As you can hear from Bruno, one of the really exciting features of working on a show like this is that it's such a wonderful challenge. One is challenged, one's own thought processes are challenged. And I learned so much in the little I worked towards this exhibition. So apropos of the title of our conversation today, Art in the Critical Zone. In collaborating on the exhibition, I took my task effectively as being that of putting past art into the critical zone. And by past art, I meant actual artworks, aesthetic objects in the most traditional and seemingly obsolete sense and form, framed canvas paintings, however improbable that may be. I wanted to mobilize these literally, that is, to hang them in the exhibition at the ZKM, but I also wanted to mobilize these paintings figuratively to activate them for the critical zone as arena of argument and of decision. Having worked with Bruno for many years now on several projects, I understood what he wanted from images. He wanted images that make you think. We wanted, in other words, Denkbilder, thoughtful, thought-provoking images for critical zones, which is understood by Bruno and Peter Weibel as a Gedankenausstellung, a thought exhibition. Now, because I'm speaking virtually at the Warburg Institute, with these images being transported to you everywhere, I think it's also right to say that we wanted something akin to what Abby Warburg termed Bilderfahrzeuge, image vehicles, pictures that allow you to travel, pictures, in fact, literally that could travel to the ZKM, and pictures that hung in the critical zone would take us to different places and different times. So where did I want these vehicles to take us? I found ones that told us one place to go. They gave the typically romantic answer of where we're always headed. Where are we going? Asked the hero of Novalis's novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, and to which a little girl who pops out of basically out of nowhere in the novel answers, always homeward, immer nach Hause, immer nach Hause. In fact, these home-based paintings brought from were able to be brought from the Karlsruhe Kunsthalle. I brought the images to the ZKM from the Kunsthalle with its amazing old master collection. But these were home-based paintings. These ones actually there in Karlsruhe were in different ways thought pictures about returning, or rather about what Bruno has challenged us to think, which is about landing on Earth, As Bruno explained, the word critical zones implies, among other things, an argument, a crisis, and a turning point. It's a dangerous zone. And we had scarcely got used to the idea of deep time, which upturned historical thinking by introducing an unthinkable billions of years. Humans, as one popular writer put it, humans crashed the party late at 11:59.56. 4 seconds before the end of the day. That's how one metaphor puts it. Dreadful in some ways, geological thinking was comforting in others, because it said that although humans will likely vanish, on this scale, there's lots of time ahead. But then suddenly, geological time told us it's the end of the day, at least for us. This painting by Kreisbeck, canvas, is a thought image made for danger. It's a complex historical object. It reaches back to the art of Peter Bruegel, Hieronymus Bosch, and medieval portrayals of hell, but it's also a memory that flashes up at a moment of danger, our moment of danger. It's a critical zone, and the climate, as you can see, I hope on your screen, looks decidedly grim. This isn't territory. It's certainly not Heimat. We're at a slimy edge between land and sea, with an armada of demons cluttering the water and foul liquids wetting the earth. Ostensibly, it's a scene of a hermit in his spiritual crisis, St. Anthony's crisis. Whoops, want to get back to it. Moved. Should be. Sorry about this. There we go. The hermit has left home, gone out into the wilderness to be alone in his devotions, only to be tempted and tormented by an army of demons. But the key, though, is the gigantic face that looks across at the saint. He's up to his neck in demons and a rising ocean. And maybe you guessed it, he's not just anybody. He's actually a self-portrait of the artist gazing in horror at his own condition. It's a self-portrait dissolving, as it were, in the biofilm with demons outside and inside. They're like the microbes of the critical zone, and they're rather polite, actually. I could go on, but that's not my purpose here. Here's how the Kreisbeck's monstrous self-portrait hangs now in the ZKM. It's flanked on the right by a remarkable still life of animal and vegetable denizens of a forest floor. Art historians call this a sottobosco painting. And flanked on the left, we have a Dutch portrayal of cold weather. It's 1665 in the midst of the Little Ice Age, and the lime kiln is belching smoke. It's no wonder that it was the Dutch who invented the term atmosphere with their damp climate and sky-filled landscapes. My little exhibition traced a line from the 17th century through to Romanticism via paintings like this, Caspar Wolff's Alpine Landscape, which traces the circulation of water from the sky through the melting glaciers and subterranean channels into the river of sea. And I was preparing the way to the Denkbild shared among many of the collaborators in this exhibition, Alexander von Humboldt's amazing gatefold engraving of Chimborazo, which Humboldt summited in 1802 when it was believed to be the highest mountain on Earth. There's a lot to think about in this image. I'll point only to three features at this point. First, it's a precocious portrait of the critical zone, the thin biofilm, the narrow pellicle of a few kilometers up and down where life exists. Humboldt even includes and labels the microbial world below, the fungi and various life forms under the soil. Second, it's a portrait of the critical zone as a system and as a whole. The main point of the engraving is plant geography, which pictures the interaction between living things with their environment in general and in specific with each form of plant life in the image, flourishing at a particular altitude and latitude. And third, and most importantly for me, for the question of Denkbilder, Humboldt expresses the critical zone in the form of an image, specifically a landscape view, which he called quite decidedly a Naturgemälde, a nature painting, with the word painting stressed. That is, he understood that his picture of nature as a whole was best mediated to humans in the form of a holistic picture, always a tableau, or what he calls an Ansicht, for a situated beholder. So we're looking at all this information, but it's information which is turned into an Ansicht, turned into a view, trying in a way to mend already what Bruno likes to term the bifurcation of nature. So this encouraged in the exhibition the display of nature paintings in the Romantic tradition, which the Kunsthalle had in rich supply, including for me what was personally the pivotal Denkbild, Caspar David Friedrich's little canvas depicting a rocky reef. It's a tiny painting, smaller than your computer screen for most of you, but it's a remarkable work full of thought, including thought about endings, both earthly ends, spatial ends, temporal ends, and with always a glimmer of a kind of perhaps secular, perhaps not secular apocalyptic ending. Bruno loves threesomes. He likes things in three parts. So I'm going to only give you three little points about this picture. First of all, where we stand at the edge of land, probably somewhere off the Baltic Sea, perhaps in Rügen, where Friedrich liked to paint. we're actually set back beautifully from the edge so that the edge is itself far from us. There's a long walk still to go before we come to the edge of the earth. Then there's what we see from this edge of the earth, that strange reef, which is a place you can't land. It's almost saying this is not where you can land, and yet it's the object of this visual and aesthetic scrutiny, a kind of artistic version, his own understanding perhaps of the Kantian Ding an sich. But it's also a cipher for history, for human history and natural history, in the form of the romantic science of geology, geognosis, knowing the world by looking at its sedimented character, a kind of romantic science. But it's also, I think, in a way, Friedrich's attempt to represent the unrepresentable, the kind of ambiguous object, this thing that is almost aesthetically aberrant, very hard to portray, and there it is out there. How do we represent that catastrophic and nonetheless fundamental aspect of the world? My third and final point is why we can see. We can see because the whole thing's bathed in moonlight, or what the German romantics love to call mondbeglänzte Zaubernacht, the moon glimmering magical evening. Why a moonlit magical evening? Well, it certainly is moody. It's a romantic mood, which means it circulates in our subjectivity, but much more importantly, the moonlit landscape is, according to a romantic understanding, a landscape completely lit by reflected light, not by direct light. And therefore it's nature in a self-reflective state, nature in a self-reflective state. And that nature self-reflective gives us back a image of ourself in our self-reflected state. And what the romantics called that way of listening to what nature is telling us in that self-reflective state gave the title to my little cell of the exhibition, which was Earth Tidings, Erdkunde, the tidings we have to listen to from that inscrutable object out there in off in the Baltic Sea. So that's all for now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joseph. Much to see and much to think with in that presentation. And now for our third speaker, I'd like to move to Frédérique Aït-Touati, whose work in history of science and comparative literature has been extremely helpful to me and to students in the MA at the Warburg who've been reading some of her work on theater and representing the world. So Frédérique, I know you were very involved in critical zones, as you have been in many other exhibitions. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts about art in the critical zone with us now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much to the Warburg for this beautiful invitation. I will try to share my screen, first of all. Basically, I will share mostly images with you tonight. Here you are. Well, speaking after Bruno and Joseph is not very easy, so I decided I would basically try to illustrate Bruno's talk with a few images, and I would like, first of all, to place this little series of images under the patronage of two great historians from the Warburg Institute, Svetlana Alpers and Francis Yates. Alpers, as you know, studied beautifully the arts of describing, and yet studied the theater of the globe as a kind of cosmogram, and in fact, as an art of inhabiting. And this will be basically the 2 points I will try to make and to develop with a few images with you tonight. First, arts of describing, in the sense of Svetlana Alpers, an art, if you consider that basically it's an art which dialogues with the science of its time, exactly like optical theories and instruments were crucial to the development of cartography and painting in the 17th century. Well, today, what is interesting is the way in which, as you mentioned earlier, the critical zone concept comes from science and then moves to philosophy and social sciences, and then is taken by artists. So one of the questions that interests me very much is how can we make the link today between the great moment of discovery that happened in the 17th century for redescribing the earth, and how can we relate that to our own redescribing of the earth. So just to share with you those old cartographical images of this kind of critical zone, first of all, and then the long history of the globe as a representation, just a few images, because you know that very well. But what interested me in relation to Bruno's work is to try to imagine that we have to redescribe the earth with new optical instruments. And what I want to talk briefly about that Bruno mentioned is the work called Terraforma, which starts from the idea that we lack some kind of representation. We lack the new maps in a way for this critical zone. It's the Alexandra Arène that Bruno mentioned, who has been working a lot on that. So what we try to do with Alexandra and Axel was to equip ourselves in a very simple way, like in a way Robert Hooke redescribed the terra incognita of our Earth. Just a few images of Hooke. And those optical instruments that we try to share and who are still very much in development allow us to enter in a new way in this critical zone, basically. And one of the features of this critical zone is that it's, as you know, made by the living and not occupied by them. So again, what I find really striking at the moment is the way in which these arts of the critical zone actually are very much inspired by exploratory art. This strange drawing I show you is a kind of portolan, in a way, is a kind of map in which we tried to show how living beings create the critical zone by their movement and their interaction, making a kind of landscape. And that's another portolan which was very inspiring for us. So my question in a way is in what way those arts of describing, which is this new art of the critical zone, is very much engraved in this long history of giving shapes and giving new images to the earth. That's the model that Bruno told you about a bit earlier, the moment when Alexandra reverses this the globe by putting the atmosphere at the center, and suddenly the critical zone, the whole point of this operation, graphic operation, is actually to suddenly give the critical zone a very large space on the page. And that's very interesting again, because it's an optical distortion in a way. It's anamorphosis, but it's a graphic gesture which we try to make into also a gesture that helps to reconsider what is inside this critical zone. It's also an optical lens in a way, and as you can see, when you take the model and you apply it to, this is in Lyon, the chemical valley near Lyon, then you have suddenly almost this kind of organic feeling that this critical zone is actually full of things, of living beings, of movements. It's not at all either flat or fixed. And of course, you can see that again, the graphic references are going back to Kirche here, the middle of the 17th century again, which might be something that we might want to discuss afterwards. Why do we go back in our attempts, very tentative drawings? Why do we go back to this kind of things? And that's another part of Kirche, Mundus Subterranean.
That's une autre solution. She is coming here. Tu avais montré tous tes diapos?
Oui, pratiquement.
Attends, je vais chercher une chaise.
Okay, sorry, I just continue. I don't have my, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I was almost done anyway, so you won't see the rest of the pictures, but it's a shame. I wanted to show you a bit of Bruno on stage in the critical zone. So what I wanted to mention now is the idea of art of inhabiting in reference to John cosmograms. And the point I'm interested here is the fact that one of the questions asked by the critical zone is really a problem of inhabiting. Yeah, it's exactly what I'm talking about now. That's happening. How do we inhabit together with other living beings? How do we share the space? And how do we actually make buildings in relation to this space? I've been very disturbed by all that. So I think I will end now and maybe get my thought together for the discussion with Bruno and Joseph. But thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Frédérique, for the images, for the talk, and for the sang-froid of getting from the first part to the second part, and so dramatically illustrating the challenges of inhabiting space together. Thanks to all three of you for really, really fascinating and provocative interventions, which illustrated some of the key notions in critical zone, but also gave us a taste of the exhibit, of the many amazing pieces in the catalog, and the way in which different perspectives are intercrossing to try to open up this intellectual and conceptual space. I'll start now. It's a conversation to all of you. I'll just start with a question, maybe not the simplest, but what comes to mind from listening to the three of you, and especially the question you raised, Frédérique, about why this return to the 17th century, what it does for us. Because if we think about it, showing Hooke and his microscopes, this is the birth of a certain kind of naturalism or objectivism, right? Where with certain instruments, we're separating ourselves from the thing that we're studying, which of course is one of the accelerators of the so-called great acceleration, that we think we're simply observing the world when in fact we're producing hybrids, we're mingling with the world, and all of the modifications and mutations that now are taking the form of climate change are going up around us while we think we're somehow outside of it. And the challenge of Gaia, the challenge of the Anthropocene, seems to be to somehow reconnect with those objects without that separation of objectivity, without seeing it through those lenses. So I wanted to think about, and obviously the generative capacity of those ways of looking and those tools you've highlighted beautifully. They give us so many new ways of seeing that we can adapt for trying to represent this critical space where we are, like in a Mobius strip, completely part of the thing that we're studying. But following on Joseph's point about the various paintings he looked at, each of them had an element of auto-portrait, of self-portrait, that in looking at the object, we're also seeing ourselves. And I would take that even further with the Humboldt image that you showed. You know, it's not simply a landscape, it also shows the instruments in that drawing that are used to construct the landscape. It's an incredibly reflexive image that shows how it itself was made. It's an artwork that shows its own making. So I wonder if that kind of strategy of representing the act of representing is somehow necessary for the images of this new geography or this new representation of the critical zone. And it also makes me think of Bruno's point about, in relation to the novel that you described, that the novel is able to describe this landscape, but always from the point of view of a subject. It tends to individualize. It tends to bring us back to the cogito, to bring us back to the single subject. When the challenge, as I heard you saying, Bruno, is to create representations of this space which is shared that are somehow of the collective. They show the collective, and the collective participates in them. So somehow the forms of art that we inherit from modernism, which tend towards the individualizing, tend towards the subjectivizing, and also tend in some ways towards detachment, are one of the big challenges, it seems, that we're facing in trying to create arts that encompass this space that we are actually part of. So I just want to put that to all of you, the thinking about instruments or ways of seeing that allow us to see us and our ways of knowing as part of making that landscape and being part of that landscape, and also ways of seeing and ways of thinking that allow the collective to participate and be seen in that representation. So that's quite a broad gathering from all of your presentations, but I put it out to you to see if it sparks anything. Joseph, I see your hand.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'm also inspired by Bruno and Frédérique's evocation of geopathy. The painting by Kreisbeck is of Saint Anthony. Is traditionally it's the scene of Saint Anthony's apathy, literally in religious terms, apatheia, no pathos. What you do is you withdraw from the world and don't have pathos. And the self-portrait in the picture is this kind of explosion, inflation of subjective pathos, centering on the artist, centering on the fact that the artist's pathology is that he paints and he has these thoughts, and it's a whole kind of science of the imagination, but it juxtaposes the apathy of the traditional Christian saint with the pathos of the artist who's trying to represent it. And this pathos then is also contained in the idea of atmosphere and weather and the biosphere, literally all these microbes crawling around him. And so, and then it goes forward to romantic art, which is an art so much around geopathos. That is, that rock of Caspar David Friedrich is a rock which is supposed to be pathos, invoking by the senses of yearning, senses of nostalgia, senses of loss, everything that could constitute romantic pathos in that rock. But just to go back to the question of 17th century landscape painting, I see actually a colleague of mine, Sarah Mallory, in the audience, that one peculiarity of Svetlana Alpers's art of describing is that she takes Dutch art and its descriptive characteristic to be analogous to maps, and to be in some sense far more perhaps flattening and geometricizing and abstracting than they are, because one of the most salient features for any beholder of 17th century Dutch art is the fact that it kind of inflates the flat landscape with this massive sense of sky, air, turbulence, and so forth, and climate effectively. And so the interesting thing there is that at that point, the direction forward for 17th century Dutch painting would have been in that sphere where the pathos of the aesthetic experience of the landscape, the map making possibilities of perspectival representation, and also this new and particularly Dutch interest in the physicality of the interim zone, of trying to picture the interim zone that is the critical zone, all comes to a head. Those are just some thoughts.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Joseph, what is the geognosis? Can you tell us more about the geognosis?
Geognosis was
geopathy.
Right. I like geopathy more because it's much more tune with what artists were trying to do. That is that the gnosis, the knowledge of earth, that the artist in romantic art and science was supposed to acquire, possess, and reproduce, was a knowledge that the natural forms out there were, for one thing, very importantly, developmentally created. There was a history to them. That if you read the world the right way, you read it as a historical phenomenon, but not as a human history, but as a kind of history in eons. So what in the simplest terms, what somebody like Caspar Friedrich would have been thinking of is not only does he study that curious reformation and mediate it through his painting, but the more he knows about natural history, the more he delves into the layered characteristic of everything one sees, the more he understands nature as development, the better the painting will actually be. And the better the painting is, the more people will understand, and there will be a kind of communal result, the name of which, of course, in German is Bildung. Bildung. We will, which is so important for Humboldt. That is, we are actually turned into the image of these images by having these wonderful images. So the creation of the right picture, the right ongoing picture of the natural world, and turning it into a built will be something that will educate and allow people then to scrutinize and understand the development out there, and the development always in the heart, in the pathos.
17th century.
Mm-hmm. Yes, maybe I can just continue on the 17th century that Joseph was talking about. To try to answer you, John, tools. Yes, what are the tools we are building to describe this new critical zone? Maybe I just want to mention the importance of, in the title of the catalogue, art and science of the critical zone. And what is striking, of course, in the 17th century is the way in which tools are tools made by scientists and artists together in a way. And this is maybe something I can try to relate to the one of the amazing articles that actually Bruno has written with Alexandra Arend that we have mentioned a lot, and Lenton, which is an article in which you can really see that geophysicists today and a philosopher and an artist, architect have to build together their tools, exactly like in the 17th century. So that might be one of the reasons why we are in a way touched and attracted by this period of time as well. I don't know, what do you think?
But I'd like to know from both of you, since we have the 17th century and the Romantic period revisited, and you mentioned that, Joseph, that it's a sort of necessity of a situation, of a reading backward, so to speak, the whole history in which we were engaged, which was no longer a history of development, but a history in a way of development plus a catastrophe we read. And then we have to sort of change our view. For instance, Romanticism was, German Romanticism was supposed to be behind us. And now it's not behind us. I mean, Humboldt is, of course, resurrected everywhere, as you did yourself. So, and then, of course, you can go back to the 17th century as well. And you can go back to probably other period of art history. So there is as historians, one of science and history of art, I would be interested to know how you handle this retrospective rehabilitation, so to speak, of everything which was past, which is now becoming interesting in a different ways.
I think in that sense, the idea of which Walter Benjamin speaks about very powerful in his late essay about images coming back in moments of danger, in a sort of flash, which is his model of the Denkbild, makes a certain degree of sense, that there's on the one hand something about those pictures that maybe in their pathos that speaks in the present moment. And then there's the history that's wrapped around them as the particularities, for example, of Romantic science, the interplay between Romantic science and Romantic art, the ways in which the two were institutionally, intellectually, in terms of publishers, actually not in any sense separated. And then there's a kind of very marked separation between the scientific and the artistic in the course of the 19th century in Germany. But I like, that's a kind of history of science and history of ideas aspect, which I think is important to trace back. But there's also something, I think, inherent for probably different reasons, but nonetheless very powerful in Romantic landscape, that it's generally apocalyptic. And that I remember working, Bruno, together with you on ways in which the history of art offers resources for imagining the end of time. The end of time, which was seen to be very imminent in the Middle Ages, but then gets pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. But in the Romantic period, there was a very strong sense that all these natural phenomena and all the knowledge and then the geognosis that is being produced has as its geopathos a pathos of end time. And in fact, in the painting, it all kind of knits together. In the painting in Karlsruhe with that reef off in the water, he takes that reef, that same exact cipher, from another painting he painted, which is called The Sea of Ice, in which human history in the form of a shipwreck is dwarfed by natural disaster, raising issues about what time scale is the end going to come. And so I think the Romantic art is a very interesting also on this issue of a kind of ways of picturing an ending that's going to take place in unusual chronologies, either very fast or very slow, but that it places us not in front of a eternally progressing time span, but it means for us some cipher, not just that we're going to die, but some kind of cipher of the erasing of humanity, the erasing of human history. So I guess two sides. On the one side, these are historical objects, and if you dig back at the historical time period, you get trajectories that are very interesting as alternatives to our current Denk styles. But in another way, these for me are kind of like atemporal flashes in the sense that actually both Warburg and Benjamin think about images. How do they survive? How do they flash forward and become rescue operations? Rescue, like life preservers.
Yeah, I think this is so beautiful the way you say it, Joseph. But I'd like to go back to your word of resources, images as resources. And I remember in one of our discussions with Bruno, in one of the plays in which we were trying to go beyond or elsewhere than the blue marble, the image of the earth as a blue marble, as a globe. This is an easy one, but interesting one. How do you go beyond this kind of strong images, which have been built through history of art, of course, but and it's interesting then to see the strange Kircher images, or both very new, strange images like the ones of Alexandra Arène, and historical images as resources to break those ingrained images, which we don't manage to go beyond otherwise. So I like very much the idea of this flash, which is ahistorical. Of course, quoting Kircher means something about the whole period, but in a way there is an inherent power in those images which touch us. But then I would like to ask the same question to Bruno. Why do you use so much literature, art as resources yourself? I mean, in your last book, of course, it's Kafka, and you told me a few times that you don't really like Kafka, but you needed it. And it's the same in a way with, of course, with the way in which you used as resources the beautiful 18th century or romantic paintings that Joseph shared with you, and all this idea of images as a resource for thinking. I think we should ask you that question again as well.
But I did 3 shows with Joseph, and every time the part where Joseph entered into old art, to the dismay of a place where we were doing it, because it's a modern art place, and at the time of avant-garde was still, now of course nobody talk about avant-garde, but at the time it was a bit surprising to go back to old art. Joseph mentioned a very important aspect of it, is that the painting are real painting in the place. So the presence of a painting in the place is of course a very important element, and the painting is physically, I mean, it has a physicality which is extremely important as well to describe what the critical zone actually looks like. So there is a whole set. We are trying to get some light. we didn't see, this is an atmospheric situation. We didn't think about the fact that the night was going to come and then we'd become invisible. A funny transformation of a show. And I'd like to, that's beautiful. Wait, thank you very much. So we are trying to arrange the show. Sorry for that. Thank you very much. So there's a whole interest aspect in having the real works of art, I mean, the old art, that, as I questioned before, the shift is also looking back to things which were past, which are no longer past, not only because they are there as a culture, I mean, as an example of culture, but because they deal with the transformation of the earth, on which we look now backwards with some envy, so to speak. I mean, some moment, and I'd like to know more about the invention of the atmosphere that the word invented and the thing invented in Joseph's argument about the Dutch art. And you also have in the catalogue a very interesting element about the landscape itself. I mean, the whole sea-like space, which is so important now in understanding the critical zone.
Yes.
So if you talk about the atmosphere, I would be interested in.
Well, a couple of things following up. The fact of the original works of art changes the temporality, I think, of people in a museum, because it slows things down, and the physicality, the presence of paintings should have hopefully that effect of bringing you down to not necessarily to earth, but to the pigments, to the ways the pigments work. In relationship to atmosphere, as my colleague Sarah Mallory, again, who's on this call, has pointed out to me, the word atmosphere was a translation from the original Dutch word dampvloed, a kind of balloon of dampness, to try and describe the particularities of this intermediate zone between the earth and the outer and space that was embracing particularly the damp and climatically challenged area of the Dutch Republic. But and the other side of things is that recent histories of Dutch art have begun to get at that typically Dutch landscape with the low horizon and the gigantic amount of clouds and atmosphere. It didn't take people looking at landscapes and painting that way. It was actually seascape painters who were the original creators of that low horizon with no flanking, no framing elements to the right and to the left, in order to give a sense of what it's like to be out at sea. And that relates, of course, to colonialism, to the relationship between land and sea in the transformation of Europe. But it's registered in Dutch landscape directly, in that it is from that formula of the low horizon, the vast atmosphere, and nothing at the sides, an atmosphere as this clod of wetness, that then Dutch landscape painting has its golden age, with the landscape painters who paint landscape in the image of seascape. So that's the interesting reversal, is that seascape comes first, much to everyone's surprise. just a sort of pedagogical point and a kind of shout out to Bruno. Whenever I talk to art historians, developing art historians, of how they should think about their craft, they can do whatever they want, obviously. But one thing I say that might happen to you is a philosopher, thinker, challenging person like Bruno Latour will come to you with some theme, and you're going to have to come up with examples. And it's not going to be, whatever you say about the examples is not as important, though he's going to ask you about the examples and force you to know them. But it's more important that the example be a good one and that it's something that you can work with. So whether it was Hieronymus Bosch or images of iconoclasm, there was an amazing print that we would talk about together. These images became, in that sense, really Denkbilder for actually being able to think and even design exhibitions. The iconoclast exhibition was partly designed in relationship to the 16th century engraving against idolaters. You might remember that big face of a human being with everybody crawling around. And so images can get, and now with the critical zone, of course, the exhibition is itself a kind of image, or a difficult to create, rightly difficult to imagine image of what an exhibition should be.
That's clearly what was so strong in the notion of landing. That's the subtitle of a show, which is Landing on Earth.
Right.
Science and politics of landing on Earth. And we have been exploring in the last 3 years all of the effect of this metaphor. So it's not exactly an image, but it's a movement. Mm-hmm. Landing itself, without crashing, if possible, landing as a powerful, mobilize a powerful set of affect and images. So it's also in the sort of directioning. I mean, as you analyze this of Gaspar Fredi's shows, I mean, it's also a way of organizing not only space and time, but the whole vector, the whole movement to it.
Yes.
And landing on Earth, especially if you add science and politics of landing on Earth, suddenly people have asking the question, I mean, why should I land on Earth? I thought I was landing on Earth. And the answer is, no way, you are not on Earth. You were moving somewhere else.
Yeah.
And immediately a whole set of it's not exactly images, nor metaphor, nor myth, but it has a mythical aspect to it. Landing is very powerful because we were supposed to be moving up, not, and so it's sort of capturing a lot of other affects.
Yes. Well, with Friedrich, I think of Caspar David Friedrich, I think of two things. One is that he represents a state of being in which landing is impossible, literally coastlines that no craft could possibly land, reefs that your boat will be crushed against. And on the other side, in many of his works, you have this typical romantic moment in which I showed that once drawing, in which the artist isn't looking up or away, they're looking down at their feet. And what they're seeing in their feet is some kind of phantasmagorical and real subterranean pockets, be they caves or mines or crevices that augur things about human and natural history. But the idea is landing, and you've got to get into the earth. But in both cases, as one French observer of Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes, they're both tragic representations of landing.
That's a fairly good assumption.
There's a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. I want to return to this distinction between geopathy and geognosy. I think I don't think we've landed on one of the two. I think they're both very compelling in their way, but they really push in different directions in terms of how we know this space, in that the geognosy has its kind of Neoplatonic and Gnostic source. It's rising up out of the body to some kind of knowledge and view of the whole, but that means leaving the earth in some sense, whereas the geopathy is putting us in the space of the aesthetic, the sensational, and yet it's much more fluid and much less fixed. So I think maybe we need a geognosticpathy or geopathnocity or something like that. Somehow we need all three of the roots. it's the question of how, is it through seeing? Is it through feeling? Is it through more classic epistemologies, or some way of moving either systematically or poetically between the three that's required? There's that, I just want to put that out there. In the chat, we have a question about Sicht or Ansicht and tableau, whether these terms that you use, Joseph, bring with them a different kind of understanding than the English picturing. If that's closer to what Frédérique was talking about, where the instrument and the seeing are merged, that the instrument is a kind of art, that the art and the instrument aren't so separated. That's one question. And then another one that very much connects to the discussion you've been having about the ocean as the original landscape, as the original atmosphere, and the difference between seeing landscape on a boat and then coming back to Earth, somehow landing. The question here from Mark Whedon is, prior to air travel, artists were limited to an earthbound horizontal point of view. Their landscape perspectives were limited to the critical zone in which they lived and moved. How has the advent of air travel, let alone space travel, altered our perspective on the critical zone? If it has this modern vertical aesthetic? Is this modern vertical aesthetic a change for the good? So in part, it's how do the kinds of objects that the vehicles that we move through, and Bruno, your down to earth starts with the image of the passengers in an airplane, just wondering if they can land. How do those vehicles shift the kind of image vehicles that we require to visualize this space or to understand this space? So a lot of things out there for anyone to pick up.
Maybe a few things about space, since you invite us to think about it. Indeed, the radical change in the notion of critical zone is the very definition of space. And this is maybe the other reason why the 17th century is so interesting, because of course it's when the Cartesian res extensa was defined and actually was also used, as you know, in theater, for instance, as a definition for the theater space. And of course, what we are seeing now is this notion of space, which has never been experienced, is completely crumbling. And in a way, we need all the senses you mentioned, John, seeing, feeling, moving, to redefine altogether this new space. And that's a way to answer your previous question as well. Why is it interesting to go back to those 17th century art or way of doing? Well, precisely because it started all there. I mean, I exaggerate, of course, but part of the things, part of the history, of course, that led to what we are, it started there aesthetically as well. So it's so interesting to start from inside the theater, for instance. I mean, for me, it's one of the interesting things. And at the moment with Bruno this week, with the theater team, we're working on this new play.
We are actually in a residence.
In a residence working on this new play about this gaze from above, you know, going to Mars at the moment is such a, it's everywhere in the news, and actually, well, maybe you can go on with that.
We are actually in residence trying to find another way to, not this time a show, no, a catalogue, but as we call it, a lecture performance of some sort. And it's we were very interested by the enthusiasm about Mars. And the problem is Mars has no critical zone. Mars has a surface and it's a planet, but it has no critical zone, because the critical zone is what the living organism have made of a planet, but preceded, so to speak, the proliferation of Gaia, so to speak. So what is really interesting is that everybody is fascinated by the spatial imagination of Mars, which is supposed to be plan B. And even though Mars is just a planet, and our Earth is not a planet. Our Earth is a planet which has been transformed by the living form into a critical zone, which didn't happen to Mars, or if it happened, it has disappeared long ago. So even if you find life on Earth, on Mars, you will not find Gaia on Earth, on Mars. And as you know, it is the original location of the thought experiment of James Lovelock, which determined the invention of Gaia. So we are trying to understand what it means, actually using slightly perversely, I have to say, the situation of a lockdown to say, well, okay, we are locked down, not locked down because of a pandemic, but we are locked down because we are inside the critical zone. And those who imagine that they can go out to Mars will go to a planet, not to another critical zone, even if we artificially terraform Mars, which is very unlikely. So there is a whole set of metaphors, and it's not exactly metaphor, it's actually cosmological, I mean, cosmogram, I mean, to use your term, which are organizing and redistributing space-time agency. And what is so powerful in the link with the painting and the romantic moment in the show and in the catalogue by Joseph is that at different scale and moment in history, it's exactly the same problem. And unfortunately, we couldn't get to Cézanne, which Joseph wanted very much, but Joseph had a whole interpretation of Cézanne we should have had in the show, and we didn't have it in the end. So it's interesting. I'm not sure it's called images, nor thought, nor concept. I mean, you have the term cosmogram, so it's redistributor of agencies and position. And the landing is exactly that situation. If we are secluded in the critical zone, if we are locked down, what sort of life do we now imagine as a thriving things and not as we think here in Paris, totally depressing?
Thinking about life and life zones, I'm reminded again of Abby Warburg, since it's the patron of our discussion, and how important for life form life was in Warburg's work, and life was directly related for him with the cipher for life was pathos formulas, pathos formal, and so. On the issue of the relationship between geognosy and geopathy, actually, there a little bit of historical micromanagement might be useful, which was that division was something that divided romantic landscape painters right around that time. That is, should the landscape painter be after knowledge, which was the position of Caspar David Friedrich's disciple Karus, who wrote these amazing books about the life of the earth art, Erdlebenkunst, versus what Friedrich said is, he said, no, it's not about knowledge. Knowledge is enlightened, is abstracted. It's about a pathos. It's about feeling. Feeling is the important thing. And for him, feeling was a very complicated political and one that we probably deal with as a kind of both interesting and toxic agent, because for him, feeling was German against gnosis, which was French, and something to do with the Enlightenment versus Romanticism. But it had something to do, it was directly related to how one, as an artist, is supposed to actually represent that important thing, Leben, life. That it's the life of the earth, or the life in the earth, that the artist was trying to grasp, and again, always in this tragic way, because the earth. I mean, I'm thinking about the question of seeing the world from an airplane, and of the blue planet image. One of the things that fascinated me with Friedrich, and also Bruno too, was the way in which romantic artists already imagined a kind of globe earth from above before people actually ascended to the heavens. But in Friedrich's case, it's always the cipher for that which is inscrutable. It's always the wrong way to go. It's someplace always far, far, far away, and kind of apocalyptic. It's here. It's land. It's as Bruno says, landing on earth, being here, finding, looking under your feet, being here. That's where the pathos lies.
Another question from the chat from Dante de la Pava connects to I think to the way in which you described the romantic landscape as having a kind of stratigraphy of vision within it. And you talked about that geognosy as showing the history of the formation of the earth, but also the history of art, maybe showing the history of artistic formations and the social orders that produced those ways of seeing that are there in any object, any art object. That the history of art is there in any new object. The question is more specifically about how have artistic representations of the critical zone changed as we've learned more about the world? Are there changes in other forms of expression, literature, and performances? Does this change happen across borders? For example, do the depictions of in the Americas change along with European depictions? So I think it's relating the ways of seeing to the longer history of representing something that we now call the critical zone, but that was always there, but also bringing in the question of a very 17th century issue, exploration, the changing vision of the world through conquest, through imperialism. How are those the strata that somehow have to be represented or grasped in our ways of feeling or knowing the landscape that we're proposing here? So in what ways does the history come through in
the history? I would probably defer to Frédérique and Bruno on most of that question, but the little history thing is Humboldt launches, before he actually does his literary Ansicht, his seeing of the landscape, a long history of art. He understands that the Ansicht will be fundamentally historical in context. The other issue about the situatedness of Dutch art in the colonial experience is like the most important thing right now in the study of Dutch art. In the Romantic period, also these Friedrich understood vastness as something to do with the politics of Germany, the question of Germany as a landlocked country, the question of colonialism, and that's so true that that one of the most amazing receptions of any painting of the 19th century is a group of Romantics did a review of Caspar David Friedrich's famous Monk on the Sea, and it's a parody of people walking in a museum, and a little group of school children go and look at the landscape of Caspar David Friedrich, and they say, yes, that's where the colonial goods come from. So everybody understood at 1809, 1807, that the allegorical as well as motivating circumstance of landscape was colonialism, colonial travel. And the question then is how within these, how does tell that story? And I think of Kirchner also because it relates to the issue of the relationship between allegory and landscape. Are we allegorizing these landscapes when we make use of them? And what is the history of our own use in terms of taking it and allegorizing it as an allegory of colonialism, an allegory of history, and so forth?
That's very interesting because the whole catalogue and exhibition is, of course, organized around a disjunction between the land out of which we gain our wealth, so to speak, and the land we live in. Of course, the Dutch is a typical example of this disjunction and disruption of it. And it has always been important in the definition of the science. And of course, this is also why the critical zone has another very interesting aspect in terms of scale. Because if you're on a planet, and the planet as the old idea of a globe, the human action is very limited. I mean, it's invisible. If you are in the critical zone, and if you see the critical zone, the human action is actually immense, even though the number of humans who do this transformation are actually very small. So there's a whole change of scale, which can be framed as exploitation and colonization, but which is the general features of the study of a critical zone, which is how would you sort of fix, so to speak, or make overlap the world you live in and the world you live from. I mean, this is a large part of a catalogue of a critical zone is about this question. And I'm very interested to know that you can actually follow this And of course, in Humboldt, the whole Humboldt is about this question as well, which is how do you reinterpret the notion of exploitation by the Spanish of the Latin America? And there's a whole series now of art history. The more they get into the critical zone, the more they are aware and adjusted to this disconnection between the world we live in and the world we live from, and the politics associated with it.
I can just add a few words about the importance is indeed of going back to the idea of the effect of exploration and conquest. I mean, sorry, I start again. 17th century discoveries were ingrained into that idea of exploration that was, of course, as we know now, full of political and ideological problems. But one of the reasons why I still wanted to show Hook is that it's a way to reorient those affects. The affect of exploration could be reoriented towards the critical zone and not towards the conquest. And it's very interesting now in France at the moment, the discussions we have with colleagues is very much about how do you not aesthetize, but what is the aesthetics of the Anthropocene? What is an something which would not be only negative? It's you can't remain in this kind of going back on Earth, or at least it has to be a new Earth somehow. Hence the power again of Hook and this idea of a new Earth, which is in the preface of Macrographia, a new Earth and a terra incognita to be rediscovered as we live in our flesh on this Earth. I think this is more or less the last sentence of the preface. So yes, redirecting the affect. This is what the critical zone makes, not only reconfiguring, as Bruno was saying, space, time, agency, but also the way in which we direct our desire, so to speak.
I just put up the hook if you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's beautiful. You have it. You have it.
There it is.
It's a wonderful image and a wonderful point, which unfortunately, I think, despite the fact that we could keep speaking, I think, for hours here, I think we have to bring things to a close. It actually resonates with the last question that's in the chat, which I'll just take as a comment, which is apropos of framework of vision that changes perceptions of surface. Okay, it's Juliet Simpson asking, where does works like Dürer's Great Piece of Turf relate to this? But in particular, in relation to, I think, something very close to what Frédérique is saying about Hook. Where does it stand in relation to re-examining the possibility of re-examining thresholds between an encounter of nature as wonder or an encounter of nature as knowledge or indeed as conquest? And I think that ambiguity between the wonder and knowledge and conquest, but also between pathos and gnosis, is one that we've just begun to touch on in thinking about how to represent this new world that of the critical zone, which I want to thank Bruno for opening up for us, for Joseph and Frédérique for exploring with us, and which I think we all approach feeling somewhat like the flea in Hook's image, where we've got suddenly these eyes that we didn't realize we had, looking at a world that we hadn't seen before, that's both much, much larger and much, much smaller than we'd realized.
And
so,
more critical.
Pardon?
And much more critical, as Bill said in his introduction.
Absolutely.
The word is well chosen. I have just to say that when the scientists used it, they had no idea what critical had, that critical had a philosophical history as well. They were surprised when I came along and said, well, critical, you know, it reminds me of a few other things.
So you're informing the scientists just as you're informing us about what the scientists are doing with critique. And in fact, maybe critique hasn't run out of steam entirely. Maybe we're giving it a bit more steam now. So thank you all very much for filling this atmosphere, this damp damp ball with so many wonderful ideas and images. Thanks everyone for being here in attendance. For those who suggested questions, I'm afraid we can't answer all of them, but above all, Frédérique, Joseph, Bruno, thanks so much for sharing this time with us, and we look forward to the second round.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
Bruno. Bye, John.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Frederick. Bye.